Seyi Akiwowo is founder and executive director of Glitch, which is a nonprofit organization that focuses on ending online abuse. Seyi was London's youngest Black woman to be elected as a local councillor, and she has committed her time and her energy over and over and over again to issues of equal access, racial justice, and supporting women truly all over the world. Seyi was named an Amnesty International Human Rights Defender in 2018, I believe, and Digital Leader of the Year in 2019. And just this year, earlier this year, Wired UK named her one of its 2021 Changemakers. Seyi has been the IDDP Knight Fellow for the last year, and has taken the opportunity to engage in some really important work, undertake some really important projects that she's going to share out with us today, tell her more about the things that she's been doing with her organization in the last year as part of this fellowship. So Seyi, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you. I'm gonna attempt to share my screen and hopefully only show you one of my many tabs open. 1 second. Great. First, I want to say thank you so much to Rebecca and the rest of the staff at George Washington University for this amazing opportunity to be a Knight Fellow. I make the joke that I thought it was nighttime fellow, and I spelt my proposal as in night, and then Rebecca had to kindly say, oh no, Knight like being knighted, like the Knight Foundation. And so I just want to say thank you so much for giving this opportunity to represent and be part of the George Washington University Committee at a very important time. When Rebecca and I had spoken, we had just finished the survey for our ripple effect report. And it was a moment where I just knew that the online space was going to be even more of a conversation in the mainstream, but I honestly didn't imagine it being in this way. So if we look over the last year, putting a lot of pain and grief aside, the last year has superseded conversations around misinformation, disinformation, malinformation more than I think we could have all have thought. In September, we were still in the UK, at least, going back into another lockdown, which was increasing the likelihood of online abuse for women at work. And we launched our survey to reflect that. Then we also in the UK had a supercharging of the online safety bill, but with a complete disregard for the way women experience the online space. So that was really a challenge. And then you had all things that should have happened in 2020 happening in 2021, the Olympics, the Paralympics, and the Euros. And what we saw in the summer of the Euros in 2021 was what we all know to be the case in the online spaces: horrific abuse towards players, towards Black players, the rise of Afrophobia, which is the discrimination against someone's African cultural heritage, and social media companies not being able to grapple with that, despite TikTok being the sponsor for the Euros, which is always phenomenal. But this last year has in a way been a pressure cooker for a lot of the harms, a lot of the bad digital citizenship that we have been researching about and talking about. We've also seen some stuff that's happened offline as well, and I think that's important to acknowledge. We've seen the conversation with 2 Black women who were murdered in Wembley in London, and then police officers took photos of their dead body and shared and discussed this in WhatsApp conversations. We saw conversations around Sarah Everard's murder and Sabina Nis's murder and what that meant for women's safety offline, where actually for a long time, campaigners in this space were using the offline as a kind of building point of saying, look, we've made such progress offline on violence against women, and then actually it's taken us back offline, meaning it's taken us back even more so online. So I think it's really important to talk about the year that we've had when it comes to online gender-based violence, online abuse, misinformation, so that we don't make the same mistakes again, and that we are really learning from what this pressure cooker is teaching us. With that said, I'm going to talk about for a few minutes, and I really want this to be interactive, so I'm going to pause at certain points. And if you've got questions on my kind of analysis of over the last year, I'd love to hear that as well. I'm going to talk through some of the key outputs that I promised to do as in my time as a Knight Fellow, and pause for questions, and then there can be a longer discussion at the end. And before I do that, I think I should say, going back to kind of my reflections for the last year, if there hasn't been much of it, so if there wasn't before a need to have a conversation about a public health approach to online abuse, this year has definitely shown it. We've shown that misinformation isn't just something that happens to a small group of people. We've seen that actually how it can affect the public and our health at the very same time. And that's an important lens when we talk about hate speech, which has grown offline and now we're seeing it online. And that we've also seen it with women in politics and democracy. And we can't continue with today's session without acknowledging the late David Amis, who was murdered last Friday at his surgery. And emerging evidence is showing that there was an influence of social media and radicalization. If the last year, 6 months, 6 weeks, last week hasn't said that we need a public health approach, we definitely do. And I'm really glad that George Washington University has given me that scope and space to really reflect on that. But enough of my intro. My fellowship was about talking about making on the online space safe for all women. And the all is really important because it's hard when you're a campaigner because you understand the strategic tactic for wanting to bring in celebrities and Hollywood to tell, kind of make it, I guess, a mainstream topic. But what that means is that we don't talk about the experiences of all women. And it means that we only end up focusing on white, middle class, upper class women who have the cultural or social capital to deal with this, and not women from minoritized communities or women with multiple intersecting identities. So making this online space safe for all women was a real key focal point for my fellowship over the last year. And what we saw from Amnesty International's research was that 35% of MPs, 35% of Black and Asian MPs were more like, sorry, let me start that again. Black and Asian MPs were 35% more likely to face harassment and abuse than their white counterparts. And this was a huge driver for one of my key outputs around a specific resource for women in politics. And I mean politics in the broadest of sense, because this last year has also broken up the need for just party politics being a way of making change, but charities and campaigners and activists and student societies. And so in the broadest of sense, the biggest the key output I wanted to achieve through my organization, Glitch, and this fellowship was a resource for women in politics. And I hope it's going to let me go to the next slide. So we created a toolkit. And this toolkit was focusing on digital self-care, digital self-defense, how to be an active bystander, and then also how to run a campaign with digital self-care and self-defense principles in mind. Like, how can you run a really good campaign online and offline with digital citizenship at the heart of it? And so we spent all of autumn, a bit of the spring, creating this tool, and partnered with a university in London, the Royal Holloway, because there was a professor there who was just publishing a thesis, particularly on the impact of online abuse towards women in politics and future generations. And so we created this, Glitch and I created this resource on digital self-defense, which was looking at digital security in a way of not victim blaming, which was an important language to get right, but as a way of countering what feels like an inevitable or an unavoidable situation in the online space. Then we talked about digital self-care, which was about people in politics, the MPs, councillors, mayors, campaigners, but also about the team and doing it in community and not having to just set boundaries by yourself, but making sure you're doing that in community. And then something that actually me and Rebecca were bonded on many years ago when we were in Paris at the OECD panel was around how do we support bystanders to not just be passive in seeing these things happen online? How do we empower them to support people online? And so we use that framework of online active bystander as a way that people in politics can be calling on their membership, their constituents, their supporters to be supporting them in helping address the online abuse. This piece of resource has been downloaded, and I want to give you an exact figure, but unfortunately we changed our website halfway through this, and so we've lost quite a lot of analysis. But on our old website, this was one of our most downloaded resource by women who then was calling on us to hold workshops. Oh God, calling on us to hold, sorry, I've missed this slide, calling on us to hold workshops on this, calling us to come into their political associations, their local groups, to train them on this. This helped spark a conversation where younger generation of women were seeing that they could stand in politics, start a campaign and not have to be silenced. It has led to us being working with a university body called Student Union Skills, which looks after all student unions across the university campuses in the UK, to provide a specific module now for university, student society reps, council reps, and campaigners, so that they can feel safe online too. And that's meant that our people who come to our workshop before, so people's knowledge of digital self-care and self-defense and how to be an active bystander was so low before, and with our intervention, we were able to take people to 97 and 98%. And that was the slide that was missing from before. Another element of this resource, and then I'll pause here to take questions, was around the steps to take a positive public campaign. Because it's all well and good that we've got individuals demonstrating good digital citizenship and rights and responsibilities online and encouraging other people to be safe online and to support them when they're facing abuse. But what we wanted to also try and address, or at least pilot, was how do we get people to be thinking about a positive campaign from the instance? Now, this doesn't mean that you can't be direct and be Extinction Rebellion types and be really forceful about what you believe in and holding people accountable, but just in that you don't blur the boundaries of what's keeping you safe, and that you don't also put people at risk. This has very much come from lived experience where I've supported charities campaigns in the past, and they haven't done the appropriate risk assessment, and it's then led to abuse, and it's then led to kind of re-traumatizing of my experience of online abuse. And again, this was something that we did with universities so that we could get this out onto campuses and get feedback from young people who very much appreciate this framework, who really loved the 7 steps around things that they didn't think about beforehand, but always but knew was something that they feared, but never had a way of being able to address it. And it's, again, as I said, has led us to be able to work with more universities to support young people with how to stay safe online and how to do campaigns. We would love to be able to make this interactive. I think the years of research reports and how tools and toolkits are slowly coming to the end. And I think the next step would be for us to kind of work with influencers to use TikTok, to use videos, to use animation to bring this more to life. I'm going to pause here to take questions on this bit.
Everyone. I'm wondering, what did people in that slide that you showed where it went from like 2% to 97%, what did they actually learn that they could do?
Yeah. We go through what is online abuse. I think often people have a misunderstanding of that, and at Glitch we try to frame this as a catch-all term for different tactics and characteristics of tactics that is about embarrassing, spreading harm, causing threat to your physical self or your mental well-being. And the first section really hones in on what we mean by online abuse so that people can spot it, but also then know how to defend themselves. Then we go through our kind of main top tips around digital security and try and do it in a very fun, interactive way, because we've all heard about stronger passwords, we've all heard about two-factor authentication, we've all heard about not logging in on certain websites through your social media accounts, but we have a methodology that really allows us to be interactive and use case studies and storytells so that we can influence people to actually do it. And then we talk about digital self-care, which is about how people can set boundaries and limits and expectations of themselves and other people online. And people go away with kind of an action plan around what their page policy would be, when they would want to flag and report things, when they would want staff to report things to the police, the parliamentary police team, etc., etc. So we go through those key elements. And then the last one is how to be an active bystander, which is very much also group created. People have really creative ways of how they've stepped in safely and appropriately to reduce the impact of abuse. And we try and leave people with understanding that one small intervention really could save a life. One small intervention could really reduce the risk and impact of online abuse. So those are four main elements.
Could I ask a question? And let me just say it's delightful to meet you, and I'm really glad to be hearing all of this, and my condolences to you and to everybody from what you've been going through. It's really terrible. But it leads to my question. I have a very good colleague and friend, African-American woman, who not only received direct online threats and death threats, but they specifically targeted, some of them, her daughters. And I'm wondering how you, in your toolkit and in your trainings, how you equip women, especially younger women with children, who are receiving horrific threats like that. I mean, you know, what are you counseling them? What effect does that have on behavior? Are you dealing with that specifically?
Glitch doesn't deal with that specifically, but what we do talk about is when you're online, you're not just online for yourself, but you're an entry road to your family, and your children are entry road to you. So we talk about how on Snapchat, there was a case of a girl who was sharing that she was on holiday in Morocco, which she would do, and then people knew that her home was vacant, and then they robbed her home. So we talk about how you can do all you need. You can do all you can to be safe online, but it's also really important that you're having and sharing that information with your family members, that you're sharing passports with, Google calendars with, and particularly if you're posting them online. So if you're posting photos and videos of your children online. We also talk about a specific type of abuse called shock and grief trolling, which tends to affect everybody who's lost somebody, but women who miscarry. We talk about that being a real type of abuse to not, again, silence women and not wanting to share these very important memories and milestones in their life, but that this could then lead them to being exposed, because yes, miscarriages is quite normal, but the way people receive it is still sadly is not. And so we do try to prepare people to understand that themselves and their families can make them vulnerable, or they could be making their families vulnerable. I would love to talk about it towards the end, about a public health approach, because I think when we understand the impact of online abuse and can really draw that domino effect, we can really start looking at the cycles of harm. So where I got the public health approach from was last year. I think I've spoken about this before, when me and Rebecca last was on a panel together, that we have in the UK, we have a public health approach to youth violence, and Scotland is really leading the way in this. And it looks at the levels of trauma. So you've got, if you look at in a school system when it comes to youth violence, you've got the young person who has been stabbed or murdered and died by youth violence. Then you've got their friend. Well, then you've got the people that were at the scene. Then you've got the neighborhood in which the police tapes and all of that. Then you've got their family members. Then you've got their school friends. And there's degrees of trauma when it comes to youth violence. And when you don't address violence, when you don't address trauma, it does spread. It does bring about anxiety. It does bring about the feeling that the state is not protecting you. And people then look to protect themselves that are not in the most helpful ways. I'm starting to see the same correlation when it comes to online abuse, that you're not just hurting the person who's facing abuse, but you're hurting their family members. So an example is, so I'm doing piece of research at the moment, and I've been interviewing loads of people about their experiences on abuse, including Rebecca. If you've got a unique surname, you are so searchable online that it doesn't just put you at risk, it puts your family at risk as well. So that's a direct threat. Then you've got it impacting your family members because they don't want to see their loved ones facing abuse. And then I remember when I went through my experience of online abuse a few years ago, when the police came to my house, my mum was in a state of shock and tears. So that's the way that trauma can play out in so many ways. And we're not capturing that when it comes to online abuse. And we're not also capturing, and I think a public health approach will allow us to do that, how much we're not even able to experience play and joy. Because we're so caught up in not getting death threats, we're so caught up in being free from violence, we've forgotten what we should be free to do as well. And I think that's part of public health, right? That's part of like preventative healthcare and joy and play and all of that. Maybe this the comparisons is not quite refined yet, but that's what my worry is. Like we've got trauma playing out from the direct abuse, but what about the absence of joy? I mean, we've seen over the last 18 months what the absence of freedom of going outside has done to us. And I worry of how we will start seeing this humming level of anxiety and silence and effect, where we're not allowed to express ourselves and joy and joy and play and have pleasure online and all of those things, what that will then mean for our society too. And I think that's going to have a massive effect.
Thank you.
Was that a question? No. Okay, should I continue? Let me go back to sharing my screen. Check how I'm doing for time. Yeah, cool. Right, so the other piece of output or tool that I promised to do during my fellowship was around documenting online abuse. And we have a grid that's come from lived experience of trying to report abuse to both the tech companies and law enforcement, and the onus and how onerous and how re-traumatizing the experience is. And so we've created this kind of friendly how-to resource on how to use that table so people are understanding. And of course, it's a way of us being able to get people to understand our key terms around digital citizenship and what we mean by online abuse. We did some work also this year with BT Sport, which is a huge kind of television provider of sports. I think that's the best way to describe it. You can tell I'm not a sports person, but we did a massive campaign with them, and it was huge because BT provide broadband to a lot of homes, and their sports division was looking at how online racism has been impacting players. We worked with them to develop a survey with YouGov here in the UK, and it found that 1.8 million people had suffered threatening behavior in the last year. And I'm sorry I don't have the stat to hand, but I think we're looking at we're looking at around 30% of people had seen online abuse but didn't do anything about it. So we've got this big disparity between people who have faced online abuse and are not documenting it, people who've seen online abuse and are not documenting it. And how do we make sure that we get data? Because as you all know, data is everything. Oh God. So looks like my thing hasn't saved. This has gone a bit funny, my formatting, but this is what we went through, kind of like 11 steps of documenting abuse around setting an ID for it, recording the date and time, the social media handles. Do you have an idea of who it could be, and gathering evidence and patterns? And this is huge. This is super important, because if you look at cases of online abuse, somebody doesn't just decide that they're going to just abuse one person. I mean, sometimes they do get a fixation and are stalking, but usually they have more than one victim. And there's two examples I'd like to bring up here. One is Luciana Berger, who used to be an MP here in the UK of Jewish heritage, and who faced horrific anti-Semitic abuse. When Luciana Berger was trying to build a case against some people who basically made some very threatening anti-Semitic abuse, she was able to find other people who were receiving similar types of abuse, and they were able to come together and build their case. So actually documenting online abuse allows people in political parties or community groups to share that data and intel and maybe to see a pattern. And a similar example happened actually yesterday, court case. A judge made a really good point that we've been focusing so much on offline safety that we haven't really got to grapples with how much we need to be looking at online safety. And it was essentially this man who had been stalking women for the last 10 years across Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. He had been pulling their profile photos and setting up fake accounts. He had been taking their private photos and pretending to be solicit sex from people. You name it, 10 years, multiple victims. And actually, again, people documenting and building this case. The police were able to see that this person this person's experience was similar to another victim, and build basically a group case against this person, who has now been found guilty and will be sentenced. So documenting online abuse we've seen to be an important tool in accessing justice for the victim, in gathering data, but in another way that people can be active bystanders online. Moving on to my last output, which was around Black Lives Matter last year and Black women's experience of the online space. So we had some funding, and also the fellowship was able to really top and boost that up to look at the experience of Black women MPs online. We haven't yet published this because it's still quite academic, but we hope to do it in December to mark the anniversary of our elections. But what the key findings were showing, I'm going to have to stop my screen here so I can get my notes right and not spread misinformation. We had three key findings. One's that we saw that the online abuse occurs on a continuum, that when Black MPs were being picked on or in mainstream media, in tabloid media, that was translating online, and then that was then causing like a ping pong effect. What we also found is that we found it difficult to pick up the nuances of the racism, of the hate speech, that it then made us even more concerned about how natural language processing methods would be able to pick this up, and how do we make sure that content moderators are really understanding that language is dynamic and contextual, and that is going to change in political discourse. The second key finding was that in addition to navigating their own, Black MPs been able to navigate their own levels of abuse, their own timelines, their own mentions, they were also being pulled in to call out other people's abuse and having to do that extra labor for other people. And so it felt like there was something, an added layer of difficulty or challenge for Black women who were having to do with their own trauma, but then having to spend a lot of time helping their other Black women colleagues who were going through something similar. And then I think there's the third key finding was around something that I know George Washington University has been talking about, and Rebecca too, around the access to data, how difficult it was to be able to access the data, to clean the data and to analyze it, and how our key finding was that we want to be joining the efforts to have social media companies be a lot more transparent about their data sets, so that we can do this analysis work. And that we want to be able to look at things like mentions and timelines, but also things like direct replies, like direct messages, comment sections of Instagram, which makes these things a lot difficult, but is hugely important. And actually, we think that we said in our findings that social media platforms should be making this data set available as a public good. That was our last key finding and our last kind of output from our work. So handing over the mic to you guys for any questions on that.
Shay, you know that I'm currently launching a new project myself that really focuses on expert groups, expert communities that are targets for online harassment and abuse. and that I'm continuing the interest in bystander education. As you've done so much of this work really in the trenches for years now and working to reach out to all sorts of different communities, increase understanding and education, I'm really curious about who are the people you feel like it's been relatively easy to reach with this, and who are those that have been more difficult but you see as absolutely essential to getting through to? You know, what's sort of been, to think of it another way, what's sort of been the trajectory of those you've been working with and who have been getting the message, and who do you essentially see as left, who you really want to be hearing and learning from these things?
Yeah, really, really, really good question. I think the communities that it's been really easy to engage with on bystander interventions has been those that are disproportionately impacted, which I think mirrors the findings from the Black Women MPs report, that Black women not only had to deal with their harassment, but were having to do the emotional labor of helping report other people's. So in our workshops, when we talk about this, women are already saying they're doing these things anyway, and then sharing the tips, so that it didn't feel like there was a gap in knowledge or a real push to kind of to convince them. It was just to do it with more appropriate methods. A group that we found most difficult to engage with, honestly, has been white men, to see that this is a problem. And I think that's because, and I go back to a conference I was at in Canada a few years ago, where we were talking about online hate speech. This was before the pandemic. You know, we were talking about how bad the internet was then. And a white man stood up and said, I just don't see this stuff. I just don't see this. And everyone was like, well, you know, I wonder why. And I think because timelines are created, algorithms and all of that, they're the ones that need to see that this is bad and intervene. It isn't quite going through, and so they need to see it, and then we need to equip them. And I think we're having the same parallel conversations offline after Sarah Everard, after Sabina, about it's not just enough not to be the one that's done the murder, but to call out toxicity of your friends and your WhatsApp groups. So I think that's been difficult. A group that I've loved working with, and I think can be real game changers if we were to kind of have more investment in this, is employers, is companies. So we work with BT Sport, not just on the data set, not just on the AI tool that was kind of scraping instances of abuse during matches, but we also work with them on how to respond to online abuse, because it's not just enough for them to join the campaign to say tech companies need to do more, governments need to do more. We definitely believe that's true, but we also have a part to play. So we had to take them on a journey to understand that they have a responsibility too. And so we spent hours training them up on what online abuse was, how to spot it. What we found is that there was a need to do kind of the offline education too, like understand what is sexism, understand what is homophobia and all of that, to then know how to spot it online. And then we got them to a place where we got them responding to online abuse on behalf of players, on behalf of pundits, on behalf of their team, who felt like they were the ones that had to deal with it on their own. And that was a real game changer. So they were documenting the abuse more, they were reporting the abuse more, they had now a kind of dossier to be taken to tech companies. And it was powerful because they've now then been showing that best practice to the FA and the UEFA and other massive clubs who can also be helping to report it. The final thing that people that was difficult there to kind of convince them on, that I think we should all understand when we're being bystanders, is that how do you support each other? Because it is taxing to report this. It is taxing to be there looking at documenting and looking through some of these horrific things. And so we had to talk to BT about making sure they understood their duty of care and bring HR in to say, look, if you're monitoring the social media platform for boxing one night, like making sure that you've got the morning to kind of decompress from that, because it is a lot to be seeing.
That's really, really useful. I mean, I'm not particularly surprised to hear your answers about the communities that have been receptive versus those that need more outreach, but really in awe of the work that you did, particularly in that campaign. I mean, it's clear that you just had to walk people, right? Really hold hands and walk down a very far road, that the education started at such an early point. And that you did that so successfully. It's really useful. And I particularly like the point about the duty of care, even within the organization. So thinking about ways that, if you're asking your employees to help others in these matters, you also have to help those who are the helpers. I think that's really, really useful for us to think about as we try to engage these broader communities in active bystander action. Really, really useful.
And how do we start beginning to document some of these interventions so that we can make them easier to do? So I don't know if you remember, there was a time when it wasn't easy to do bystander reporting on Twitter. It's been from campaigners around the world saying that we can't report on behalf of somebody else. It falls on the victim to have to report it. Yep. So the more we're documenting these interventions and we're playing and experimenting, the more we can be calling for these safety tools as well.
Yep. And we just learned from the Wall Street Journal's reporting earlier this week about how Facebook actually introduced more friction into the bystander reporting process. So it's actually much, much more difficult for bystanders than it was even just a couple of years ago to report witnessed hate and harassment. So Twitter has gone in the right direction, but we've seen Facebook and I suspect other companies move in exactly the wrong direction.
Wow. I'm sorry, I've seen your hand, David. I think where I'd love to be able to be at it might not be in the vehicle of Glitch, it might be in a different partnership, but what I would love to see is a digital citizenship barometer, and where we're looking at what are the kind of key elements of digital citizenship that we expect from platforms. And I would really, and this could include, responding within a certain amount of period. This could be about the algorithms not producing we just saw from a BBC Panorama, I can never say that word, documentary last night that a fake troll account was being exposed to more and more anti-women rhetoric and sexual violence. So there's a need to look at that. But anyway, I would love for us to have a digital citizenship barometer index, the way you've got like a Transparency International index, and bystander intervention being a real part of that, so that it doesn't fall on the individual to always have to report the abuse. But how are we grading tech companies in their ability to make it easier to report?
So that last point actually sets up perfectly the question I wanted to ask. So thank you for that. So I'm approaching this sort of more from the natural language processing perspective, and I very much appreciate your insights regarding the contextual nature and the way in which sort of our standard NLP approaches just don't work here. And so having sort of played around a little bit in this space on the natural language processing side, and my experience having been that you can find things that work, but it's only after the fact when you already know what you're looking for. How does that shape what kind of index we might end up ultimately putting together? Because the one thing that I'm concerned about the most is that people are always finding new ways to be hateful, and they're doing it in unfortunately ways that are quite creative that we can't necessarily anticipate. So given that this is we're always going to be sort of on that liminal, on that barrier where at first there's going to be the people who recognize it, and then there will be people who don't, and then there's going to be claims of overreach and things like, just because of the nature of the problem. So what would you recommend as far as, I don't know, like in a military metaphor, we saw preparing the battle space, like, getting people to be aware of the fact that they need to, they need to expect something that's unexpected, right? How would you go about doing that?
This is my job every single day, David. Like, how do I get people to care about this as much as me? Like, how do I get people to join me in boycotting platforms and things like that? Like, this is it. And I think this is something that is in every kind of campaign issue. You see it in climate change, you see it in, you know, in women's safety, you see it in civil rights. Those that are directly impacted are the ones that are more kind of invested and passionate about it. So I think in honoring that, I think the first thing is funding, right? Funding, really supporting those efforts, those people with lived experience with pilots and pilot ideas and initiatives to keep going, but also allow them to rest. I think funding's a big way to kind of shape that power dynamic. On the index itself, you know, it was interesting. We did some consultancy for Twitch once, and you know, I was like, you should be telling people what you're doing and, you know, what you're working on, et cetera, et cetera. And they told me, if we do that, people will just cheat the system. So even there's even something sinister about people wanting to know how to break the policies and how to get around it. There are rebels like that online, and I think that is really hard. Equally, I remember when I faced my abuse, I got to use YouTube's beta version then, which enabled them to capture comments that had hateful wording in it, and then it'd be put in like a folder, and then I could review it if it was incorrect. And within 48 hours, people were realizing that their comments weren't going through, that I had my comments on, but yet their comment wasn't going through. So they misspelt on purpose at the N word and all sorts of things so that it would still come up on the comment section. So it is really tricky. So I want to acknowledge that. I feel like you're right. The balance will be that we will always slightly be reactive. But I think my problem, and Rebecca, I think you agree with me on this, is that the scale in which we are so behind, the scale in which that we are so reactive to things that we knew that were a problem, for example, with Zoom bombing and security issues, were being said by organizations like APC, Association for Progressive Communications, but no one was paying attention to them. And it only became an issue when it started affecting people in the pandemic 3 to 4 years later. Black women have been talking about the way white supremacists were organizing on Twitter, on Facebook for years, and that wasn't acknowledged and heard. So I think there is something about, yes, we will always be behind. Yes, there's going to be always ways that people are frankly going to be DICK heads on social media. But I just don't think it needs to be this bad. I just don't think it needs to have this scale of the problem. And I also want to understand how much tech companies are sharing that. This is why I think a digital citizenship barometer will be good, not because it's just because it's my idea, but because it would allow there to be an objective framework in which we're holding tech companies to account that will supplement regulation that is needed and the conversations being had in the UK. But really looking at a deeper level of what are we expecting from a tech company so that we are, as consumers, still buying into that. And it will now start, I hope, building consumer power so that people are not just thinking, oh, we're at the mercy of these tech giants. There is options. And I think an index will also tell new tech companies what we expect of them. What I don't want is this race to the bottom, that people are just going to keep building tech companies and we keep making it a multi-billion-pound profit. And they get away with being bad and breaking things fast. We can change the narrative of what we expect them to be at least, and then show mercy, then show grace with what, like, oh my God, could you have expected that? Another example, the Christchurch massacre in New Zealand a few years ago. Activist campaigners, experts were saying that you need to have a better response to things like that. That horrific video staying on the platform that long should not have happened at that time. Maybe a few years ago, maybe when the platform just started, but there were people that have been telling them this. And as Rebecca said, with the Wall Street Journal and the Facebook leaks and all of that, you know, it's not enough for Nick Clegg and Facebook to keep saying that we're being mischaracterized and that things are being taken out of hand. It really irritates me when they say that. People have been saying this for a long time and they've chosen to ignore and they've chosen to gaslight And I think that's what we need to hold those two truths. Yes, we're going to be reactive at some points, but it doesn't need to be this bad.
Jay, I really want to lift up quickly something that you said there, and then Lori, I saw that you were just wanting to chime in, so I'll make this really brief. I think that the point that you've made about listening to the early warnings coming from marginalized, minoritized people, and particularly women of color, right? This is where all of the warning signs have come from in every single one of these issues. And they've been there for literally years. And I think there's a real responsibility for those of us who, don't necessarily naturally have networks, right, with these communities and with these women in particular, to find ways to make sure that we're hearing, that we're listening, even if it's doing simple things like expanding who we follow on Twitter. In that one simple act, I've learned so much more about what's going on in these spaces than if I kept things to my usual natural networks. So I think there are lots of harder, bigger things that we need to do, but there are also simple things that those of us who aren't used to hearing these voices can do to just be more aware in general.
I completely agree. The intersectional framing at Glitch has helped me be a better ally. If I just kept campaigning or set up an organization that was based on my experience of being a Black woman, I definitely would have missed out the experience of Black women who were disabled, Black trans women who are facing different types of abuse. And I think, as you said, Rebecca, a simple thing we can do is expand who we follow, so that we are capturing these voices and these takes. I mentioned I'm writing a long piece, and at the end of this piece, I talk about my mistakes. I talk about some of the things that I believed beforehand that were not right, and one of them was around anonymity. When I was abused, I didn't know who they were. I was in my trauma, very much wanting people to be held accountable, like who they are, where are they? Let me go and see them myself. And actually, when I talk to people from the global South, what anonymity means to them, it really changed my reframing. So yes, I would say as much as we can with the algorithms, come out of those echo bubbles that might be reinforcing a very Western capitalist result or solution to online abuse, that is hyper surveillance, losing our digital privacy, that will then disproportionately impact minoritized communities.
I was going to ask, I'm sorry if I had to step out for a second, so I'm sorry if I missed this, but I wonder, in your thinking about all the different platforms that are out there, right, from Twitch to Pinterest to Facebook to Twitter, whatever, if you have one that you think of as like a model where it does offer the right reporting tools and the right way in which people can be a good bystander and or people could report what they're seeing in a way that's responsive.
I mean, the bar is low, right? The bar is low. I think the worst, and I'm really glad the Wall Street Journal confirms this, I think the worst and most difficult has been Facebook, from my experience. And I think the easiest to report on someone's behalf. So, like, I knew, for example, a woman called Wanda, who was the CEO of the Equality Trust in the UK, was going to speak on BBC Question Time, which is known for being very, very intense and can get quite volatile online. So I immediately knew that I don't watch it, but I'm going to watch it for Wanda, and I'm going to be there searching her name to report things. And I found it was a lot easier to do that. But I wonder if that's because I know how to use it. Bystander tool is not just about the tool, it's about the education. And I sit on TikTok's Trust and Safety Council, I sit on Twitter's Trust and Safety Council, and they're probably sick of me saying this, but I'm like, who knows this exists? Who knows this product exists? What are they doing to educate and to prompt people to be reporting it? By you not encouraging people to encouraging and prompting people to report it, you are then without, and I don't mean to be binary in this sense, but you are then you're not encouraging people to, you're, by not encouraging people to report it, then you are then disincentivizing people to and getting them to disengage. And so a huge part of the tools needs to be them education about it. And I think a huge part of all trust and safety councils, all tech companies' responsibility should be making sure that they're testing their products with people with lived experience, and you know, asking these questions. Why aren't people reporting? So it's not enough to be giving us their annual reports to say that we've got an increase in reporting and we've dealt with this. Who's doing that reporting is something I often say. Is it still the victims or is it still bystanders? I'd love to see a controlled research piece a controlled group research piece that looked at white men who weren't really interested in being bystanders, and then what they were doing to kind of incentivize them to be bystanders. I've gone off on a tangent there, but I get really passionate about tech companies' responsibility to make this a lot easier.
And are you aware of any like studies which have tried to compare across platforms these kinds of tools?
Sadly, no, which is why I think this index would be a really good idea to see, like, I mean, even in the Facebook hub, right? Like, is there a difference? I think there is from reporting on Instagram versus Facebook, and making sure there's a consistency there, and making sure there's the same when it comes to other platforms, because we do have that consistency when it comes to child safety. So we know it is possible. We have that same reporting mechanism when it comes to extremism. So we know it is possible for there to be shared intelligence, for there to be a shared norm of what the bar is, where it is currently is low, taking it up a notch to say that we're all going to, at a minimum, do this and invest in this.
Great, thank you. That's really helpful. We've done studies actually looking at like across platforms, how they're dealing with COVID misinformation and looking, you know, what are the policies? So you've given me a nice idea. Maybe we can do the same in this area.
That's a great idea. And I think you've seen what tech companies were able to really do to make sure that people were not incentivized to spread disinformation about COVID. Why can't we do the same with hate speech and online abuse?
Are there any other questions?
So I'll just very quickly follow up on the previous comment, which is that for things like COVID misinformation and vaccine misinformation, and there's some, you know, sort of usual suspects, and that's something that you sort of alluded to a little bit in your earlier comments. There are some people that are sort of repeat offenders. And so I'm curious if you could just say a little bit more about that, and about whether that's the sort of thing that we might be able to leverage in some way, or what sorts of pros and cons might be associated with that insight.
So I understand the question about repeat offenders.
Well, so the analogy that I have here is that, you know, in the case of vaccines, there are certain, if you will, celebrities that are just constantly putting out anti-vaccine content. And, you know, there was a report on the so-called disinformation dozen. And then, you know, there's sort of like a small number of people who generate talking points. And then there are armies of trolls, but also, you know, other people that sort of amplify those talking points. Do you see similar sorts of structures in this context? Or do you see that there are, how do I put it? Is this something that can be traced to an individual personality difference, or something that can be traced to sort of a more coordinated campaign, and maybe both?
Both, 100% both, 100% both. And the former scares me, because knowing of how insidious and coordinated it is. But yeah, again, this long research piece I've been talking to people who have been mapping kind of coordinated efforts, mapping kind of like a key messages document that they've been getting, and then now just repeating it over and over again. And some of these are influencers, some of these are actually, you know, celebrities and people with high profile. So it's not your kind of usual troll bot kind of stereotype, which why I always say that if we keep describing and defining trolls to be kind of you know, a man in his mum's basement, disgruntled, we then miss out a range of people who are trolls just by their behavior, which is why I don't think we should talk about what people look like, but the characteristics of the behavior and tactic that they're using. I definitely think it's both. I definitely think people have hit lists. I definitely think there is work on being done on forums like 4chan, but there's also forums like, which I'm not going to name, but there are also forums that are about interest groups, you know, like parenting, animal groups, that it just takes one person kind of whipping up people to say, to copy and paste something or screenshot something out of context, to then cause this kind of mob style trolling. You have people who are doxing people on these forums, on these sites, and then going onto Twitter and Facebook to then do the trolling. So there's definitely coordinated efforts. And you know, I can't not talk about how much I think this is happening in the trans rights conversation in the UK. I think there is, if we follow the money, we follow who is associated with this kind of real conservative ideology, like there does seem to be a kind of coordinated campaign, which is why I'm like, okay, it's one thing to have this certain belief, but to go out of your way to search people's names on Twitter, or search people having conversations about trans rights, and then to hop on that and then derail it with abuse, for me, feel that isn't campaigning, that isn't activism, that is trolling, that is a characteristic of trolling. So yes, it's definitely both. And why I really believe in this bystander stuff, and I think there could be a whole lot more research on adults and its effectiveness and all of this, because people don't really understand that this is a coordinated effort. So it needs counter coordinating back. It isn't going to be resolved with just one person doing it all, and then it's 15 people coordinating, you know, 200 accounts. So that's why bystander intervention is really important. We need to coordinate back.
Thank you, Seyi. I think this is incredibly important, incredibly enlightening. I'm so grateful for all the work that you and Glitch do. It's been a real pleasure to have you as the IDDP Knight Fellow for this last year. I look forward to continuing to collaborate with you and seeing other ways that we can work together to try and mitigate these harms and help reduce abuse online and trauma for individuals who face abuse. Thank you so much for all of your time and all of your energy, and thank you for taking the time today as well.
Thank you so much, and thank you again, Rebecca, for asking me to be your Knight Fellow. It's been a great year, and it's been great to interact with you guys over the last year, and more may it continue. Absolutely, and our absolute pleasure. Thank you all for coming. And I'll see some of you in person and others online in the days to come. Take care, everyone. Thanks. Bye-bye.